The autumn wind shrieked across the Nebraska territory like a banshee's wail driving clouds of grit before it, as 23-year-old Matilda Harper clutched her canvas bag and ran for her life. Behind her, the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats grew steadily louder, accompanied by the harsh shouts of 3 riders who had made hunting human prey their profession. "There goes our little bird. Don't let her reach them trees, boys." The voice belonged to Greasy Pete Morrison, whose oil-stained coat and silver tooth gleamed in the fading light. Victor wants her breathing, but he didn't specify how many pieces. Flanking him rode Snakebite Sue Carver, whose blade had carved her reputation across 3 territories. Should have taken Victor's generous offer. She called out, her voice cold as winter steel. "Now we do this the hard way." Young Coyote Kid Jenkins spurred his horse alongside them, barely 20, but eager to prove his worth. "Let me put a bullet in her leg, Pete. Slow her down proper." Matilda's lungs burned as she stumbled across the uneven prairie, her dark wool dress catching on sagebrush, while her auburn hair streamed behind her like a battle flag. 6 months had passed since her husband Jules died in that mining accident, crushed beneath a timber support that veteran miners swore had been deliberately weakened. 6 months since Victor Dietrich's company ledgers began sprouting mysterious charges against her account like poisonous mushrooms. Medical supplies Jules never received. Tools he never borrowed. Services rendered after his documented death. "Pay what you owe or work it off in my gentleman's establishment." Victor had told her that morning, his pale eyes lingering on her figure. A young widow has many ways to settle debts. She'd thrown her coffee directly at his face and fled. Now bullets cracked through the wind behind her, one splintering bark from a cottonwood just feet away. The swollen Cottonwood River roared past in a muddy torrent. But no alternative remained, and the gunmen were closing fast. Matilda plunged into the icy flood without hesitation. The water struck like a physical blow, instantly numbing her limbs. Her heavy skirts became anchors, dragging her beneath the surface as the current seized control, spinning her helplessly downstream. Her precious bag vanished as she clawed at the churning water. "Current'll finish her for us." Pete's triumphant shout echoed across the water. "Save the ammunition." On the far bank, concealed by wind-bent willows, 28-year-old Hayamovi of the northern Cheyenne had been following cattle thief sign when the commotion erupted. He wore traditional leather leggings and a sacred bone breastplate over his buckskin shirt protection, blessed for dangerous work-tracking raiders who struck ranches, always leaving Cheyenne arrows to frame his people. For weeks, he'd pursued these phantom attackers, gathering evidence that the raids were orchestrated deceptions. His aunt Wachiwi constantly urged him to abandon this quest and find a proper wife, a quiet, obedient woman, who would tend their lodge fire without bringing storm clouds to their peaceful existence. But the desperate splash below changed everything. Hayamovi saw the woman's head disappear, then emerged 20 yards downstream, clearly weakening against the relentless current. Without hesitation, he urged his paint stallion Thunder into the treacherous water. Strong arms encircled Matilda's waist just as her strength failed. She found herself lifted from certain death and pressed against a broad chest, hauled onto a powerful horse that snorted with nervous energy. Her rescuer's face was copper bronze, framed by black braids, adorned with brass bells that chimed softly. Dark eyes studied her with calm intelligence. "Hold tight," Hayamovi said in careful English. "We ride hard now." Thunder surged up the muddy bank into sheltering cottonwoods as more shots rang out behind them. They rode through the long night, stopping only when Thunder needed rest or when Matilda's violent shivering became dangerous. "Why?" Matilda finally managed during one stop, her teeth chattering. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Hayamovi considered while Thunder grazed nearby. In moonlight, this woman looked fierce despite her ordeal. Chin raised defiantly, even as exhaustion hollowed her cheeks. Not the quiet wife his aunt envisioned. "Your enemies and mine serve the same master," he said finally. "Those men work for Victor Dietrich, who sends raiders to blame my people for crimes we never committed." Every false raid brings Army soldiers closer to driving the Cheyenne from Thunder Valley forever. Understanding dawned in Matilda's green eyes. Jules found discrepancies in the mine records. Payments to unnamed men dated when Indian raids were reported. That's why Victor had him killed. Hayamovi nodded grimly. Dead witnesses tell no tales, and Victor needs your land for his water diversions. As dawn painted the eastern sky gold and crimson, they approached an abandoned farmstead, a weathered house with peeling paint and broken windows staring blindly across empty fields. Perfect shelter and perfectly isolated if Victor's men tracked them down. Set up. Morning light streamed through the abandoned house's shattered windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Hayamovi methodically checked each room while Matilda sat wrapped in his coat, still trembling from her river ordeal. Safe for now, he reported, settling with his Winchester across his knees. But they'll find this place if they search systematic. Tell me about Victor's hold on you. Matilda's hands shook as she smoothed her damp skirts. Jules worked Victor's silver mine for 2 years. Good wages, we thought. But the company pays only in scrip worthless paper money, good nowhere except Victor's store. She pulled a wrinkled document from her pocket. After Jules died, these charges appeared. Tools he supposedly borrowed when I can prove he was helping old Henrik repair his cabin roof. Hayamovi studied the fabricated charges with growing anger. Your land sits where exactly? Right where the cottonwood bends toward Cheyenne grazing grounds. Jules found survey stakes, someone planning to dig diversion channels. But those water rights belong to your people by treaty. The complete picture emerged. Victor needed to eliminate both the legal water claimants and any witnesses. The fake Indian raids served double purpose, justifying military action while terrorizing settlers into selling cheap or abandoning claims. My aunt wants me to find a quiet wife instead of chasing shadows, Hayamovi said with bitter humor. Matilda studied his profile. Quiet women end up like me, keeping heads down, accepting what powerful men say we deserve until there's nothing left to lose. Distant hoofbeats froze them both. 3 riders emerged from Cottonwoods, not Victor's gunmen. Henry and Ruth Boyle. Matilda breathed, recognizing the farming couple. They're decent people, but if Victor's men see them helping us. Henry climbed down slowly, his graying beard marking him as another struggling farmer. Ruth remained on the wagon seat, shotgun ready. Matilda Harper. Henry called quietly. We know you're there. Saw the tracks. Matilda stepped onto the porch. Here, Henry, but there's danger following. Damn right there is, Ruth said bluntly, climbing down with bundles. Victor's men came before dawn, asking about a runaway widow and her savage accomplice. That snake Pete was specific about what he'd do to folks who helped. Henry spat tobacco juice with disgust. Which is why we came. Nobody deserves what Victor's planning. Man can't even sell grain to the best bidder, has to go through Victor's transport monopoly or watch crops catch fire. Ruth bustled up the steps, maternal instincts overriding caution. Child, you're half frozen. Get out of those wet things before you catch pneumonia. While Matilda changed behind a makeshift curtain, Henry and Hayamovi discussed options. The older farmer had witnessed 15 years of territorial development falling under Victor's influence. Your tribe isn't the only target, Henry revealed quietly. Last month, Mexican bandits raided the Jacobson place, but I found boot prints matching shoes sold only at Victor's store. Creating chaos. Hayamovi realized. Make everyone fear everyone else, then position himself as the solution. Matilda emerged, wearing Ruth's spare dress color returned to her cheeks. There's something else? My sister Nora assists the school teacher in Willow Springs. She's only 20, and if Victor can't reach me directly. She paused, a strange expression crossing her face, though she seemed oddly calm yesterday when I told her about Victor's threats. Almost like she'd expected them. Outside, thunder nickered softly, warning that more riders approached from the south, inciting incident. The first bullet shattered the porch rail 6 inches from Matilda's head, sending splinters flying as she dove behind an overturned water trough. Hayamovi rolled sideways, coming up with his Winchester as 3 riders charged across open ground. "Pete's back with friends," Henry shouted, recognizing the lead gunman's black coat. Ruth demonstrated her frontier steel by sending buckshot toward the attackers, forcing them to veer wide. The blast echoed across the prairie, followed by Pete's Colt. "Give us the widow and the redskin," Pete bellowed. "Victor wants them breathing, but pieces work too." Hayamovi's first shot took Coyote Kid's hat clean off. "Tarnation!" the young gunman yelped, throwing himself sideways. "That savage near took my head off." Sue had circled behind the house, but Thunder's whinny alerted them to the flanking movement. Ruth watched the back Hayamovi called, levering another round. Matilda pressed against the weathered siding, her heart hammering as bullets thudded into wood above her head. She'd never been in a gunfight, but desperation brought clarity. Spotting a loose board warped away from the wall, she began working it free to block a window. "Smart thinking," Henry grunted, firing his Spencer toward Pete's position. The firefight lasted barely 2 minutes before Pete whistled, and his companions fell back to regroup behind boulders. "This ain't finished," Pete shouted from cover. "We'll have 20 men by sundown." But Hayamovi was already moving, grabbing Thunder's reins. "Can't stay here. They'll bring dynamite once darkness falls. Need to move while we can choose the ground. Our farm's 8 miles north, but they'll search there first," Ruth said. "Better to head for town where there's witnesses." "No." Matilda's voice cut through their planning. "If we run to your place, Henry, we bring death to your doorstep. And I won't abandon Nora to whatever Victor has planned." Again, that strange expression crossed her face as she remembered her sister's unusually calm reaction. Most people would have been terrified, but Nora had seemed almost relieved. "Besides, running just proves guilt. I want to face Victor publicly, force him to explain these charges where decent citizens can hear." Hayamovi studied her face, noting the stubborn courage burning behind those green eyes. "Town isn't safe either. Sheriff Malcolm works for Victor. Maybe so. But it's a trap with witnesses, and Victor's power depends on people believing he's legitimate." The sound of approaching hoofbeats ended their debate. Pete had found reinforcements, at least 8 riders coming fast from the mining compound. "The wagon," Ruth decided. "Henry drives, I ride guard. You two hide under canvas as harvest hands heading to the Muller place." They moved with desperate efficiency, transferring supplies while Thunder was tied behind the wagon. Matilda and Hayamovi crouched among grain sacks, a tarpaulin pulled over them. Henry cracked the reins, and the mules lurched into motion, pulling away just as Pete's enlarged posse crested the nearest hill. "Stop there, Boyle." Pete's shout brought them to a halt. "Need to search that load." Pete approached on foot, gun-drawn face, twisted with predatory anticipation. Behind him, 7 hired drifters kept weapons ready. "Pleasant afternoon, Pete," Henry said calmly. "What brings you out? Thought you preferred whiskey to honest work." "Stow the jokes, old man. We're tracking dangerous fugitives who might be threatening good folks." Ruth's shotgun clicked as she cocked both hammers. "Only dangerous thing I see is you pointing that pistol at my husband. Lower it or learn what farmers do to claim jumpers." Tension stretched taut while Pete circled the wagon, probing the canvas with his gun barrel. Under the stifling tarpaulin, Hayamovi's hand found his knife, while Matilda held her breath. "Or mighty nervous for folks with nothing to hide," Pete observed. "Maybe I should peek at what you're hauling." "Grain and tools," Henry replied evenly. "Contract work for the Muller spread. You want to explain to them why their supplies are delayed?" The mention of the powerful Muller family made Pete hesitate. Even Victor couldn't afford to alienate every influential ranching dynasty in the territory. After a long moment, Pete stepped back with obvious reluctance. "This isn't finished, Boyle. We'll be watching your place close. When you catch us breaking actual laws, you do whatever makes you feel important." Ruth replied sweetly. The wagon resumed its journey, but nobody relaxed until Pete's posse disappeared behind rolling hills. Under the canvas, Matilda found herself pressed against Hayamovi's side, acutely aware of his warmth and steady breathing. Still think confronting Victor publicly is wise, he murmured near her ear. She considered while wagon wheels rumbled over rocky ground. Wise, probably not, but necessary. My sister's in danger, your people are being framed, and good folks like Henry and Ruth are caught in the middle. The wagon rolled toward Willow Springs and whatever confrontation awaited them there. First obstacle, the Boyle farm, appeared through heat waves, like a mirage of honest prosperity. A well-maintained house with fresh white paint, a sturdy red barn, and corrals containing livestock that actually belonged to their owners rather than Victor's manipulated ledgers. Ruth had spotted dark stains spreading across Hayamovi's buckskin shirt, where Coyote Kid's hasty shot had found its mark. Get the medical supplies, she called to Henry. That wound needs attention before infection sets in. Indeed, blood had soaked through the leather where the bullet carved a furrow along his ribs. He'd maintained stoic silence during the jolting ride, but his face had grown pale. Matilda helped him down, noting how he favored his left side. You should have mentioned this sooner, she said, worry sharpening her voice. Complaining wouldn't stop the bleeding, he replied pragmatically, though sweat beaded his forehead. And we had bigger problems. Ruth took charge with the efficiency of a woman who'd treated everything from horse kicks to snake bites. She cleared her kitchen table and laid out clean cloth medical whiskey needle and thread. Strip that shirt, she ordered. The bullet had gouged a deep furrow, painful and bloody, but not fatal if properly cleaned. You're fortunate. Half an inch lower, and we'd be digging lead from punctured lung. While Ruth examined the wound, Henry positioned himself at the front window with his Spencer watching for pursuit. I need steady hands for stitching, Ruth announced. Henry's got fingers like sausages, and I can't hold the wound closed while sewing. I can do it. Matilda volunteered without hesitation. I've been a seamstress since childhood. If I can mend torn fabric, surely I can mend torn flesh. Ruth looked skeptical. Sewing skin isn't like sewing cloth. Living flesh is tougher, and the man's liable to flinch when the needle goes in. He won't flinch, Matilda said with quiet confidence, meeting Hayamovi's dark eyes. Will you? Something passed between them, understanding born of shared danger and growing trust. Hayamovi nodded once, then gripped the table edge and fixed his gaze on the ceiling beams. Human skin proved more challenging than any fabric. It was tougher, requiring firm pressure to penetrate, and Hayamovi's involuntary muscle contractions made it difficult to keep wound edges aligned. Sweat dripped from both their faces as she worked with painstaking care, her needle moving in precise stitches while Ruth poured whiskey over everything. There, she said finally, tying off the last suture with slightly trembling hands. Not the prettiest work, but it should hold. Hayamovi examined her careful handiwork, noting the neat, evenly spaced stitches. Better than pretty. This will heal clean and strong. As Ruth applied bandaging with boiled cotton strips, multiple hoofbeats sent Henry scrambling for his rifle. But these riders approached openly without stealth. 3 coming in fast, Henry called. But they're flying a white flag. The unexpected truce flag puzzled everyone. Through the glass, they saw 3 horsemen approaching at steady canter, led by a figure in a dark coat who raised his hand peacefully. That's not Pete, Ruth observed, squinting through afternoon glare. Too tall, and he sits his horse different. As they drew closer, identities became clear. The leader was Dr. Edwin Marsh, a young physician who'd arrived 6 months earlier and earned respect for treating everyone regardless of ability to pay. Behind him rode Baptiste Leblanc and Laurent Dubois, French-Canadian railway workers known for explosive expertise and fierce independence from company control. Henry lowered his rifle as the trio dismounted. Dr. Edwin approached with careful neutrality. Good afternoon, folks. the doctor said, touching his hat respectfully. I'm here on medical business. Word reached town that someone took a bullet and might need professional attention. Who told you that? Ruth asked suspiciously. Young Lucian from Victor's mine office, the doctor explained honestly. He was buying supplies when Pete's men came through bragging about winging an Indian. The lad has more conscience than his employer figured wounded folks deserved proper doctoring regardless of politics. Baptiste stepped forward with dignity, his weathered face reflecting years of honest labor. We come because Victor's men, and they now threaten everyone who questions their authority. First, peaceful Indians get blamed for raids they never make. Then honest farmers get shaken down for protection money. Now they hunt people like animals. This has gone far enough. Laurent nodded emphatic agreement, his English heavily accented, but clear. We build railroad to bring civilization, not to help one greedy man steal everything. This Victor, he forgets, there are laws even in frontier territories. Dr. Edwin examined Hayamovi's wound with gentle competence, nodding approvingly at Matilda's precise needlework. Excellent work indeed. Clean, straight, properly spaced. You've clearly done this before. Not on people, she admitted. But seamstress work teaches precision with needle and thread. While the doctor applied sophisticated bandaging, Baptiste and Laurent shared troubling intelligence from town. Victor had posted a $500 bounty on both Matilda and Hayamovi, claiming they'd murdered a mine guard during attempted robbery. Sheriff Malcolm was deputizing every available drifter and gun hand, creating a private army under legal pretense. But some people, they ask good questions, Laurent added hopefully. The school teacher wonders why Victor's men suddenly carry expensive new rifles when the mining company claims to be losing money. The preacher questions why so many Indian attacks happen right before valuable land gets sold cheap to mining interests. Witnesses, Matilda realized. People who'll remember what really happened, even if Malcolm tries to control the official story. Dr. Edwin packed his bag thoughtfully. There's something else troubling. I've been treating miners for months, and I keep seeing the same pattern. Good men get hurt in accidents immediately after they start asking questions about pay schedules or safety violations. Jules Harper wasn't the first honest man to die suspiciously. As afternoon faded toward evening, Henry took the three visitors aside for private conversation near the barn. When they returned, his expression was serious but determined. They've offered help, he told Matilda and Hayamovi. Dr. Edwin can get you into town safely. People don't question medical wagons. Baptiste and Laurent know back trails better than Pete's hired guns. But once you're in Willow Springs, you'll be on your own against Victor and his corrupt sheriff. Matilda straightened her shoulders with visible determination. Then we'd better make certain we're prepared for whatever devil's bargain Victor wants to offer. But as they prepared for the dangerous journey, none noticed the subtle warning signs and the way discussions of Nora's safety brought that strange, calculating flicker to Matilda's expression. Or how she paused when recounting her sister's oddly calm reaction, as if some piece refused to fit properly into place. Rising action. The medical wagon rolled into Willow Springs as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and crimson that reminded observers of blood and gold, the two currencies that truly ruled frontier territories. Dr. Edwin had provided careful disguises. Matilda wore a starched nurse's apron and cap, while Hayamovi lay covered with blankets, supposedly a railroad worker injured in a blasting accident. Baptiste and Laurent rode escort, their familiar faces, lending credibility to the emergency medical story. Willow Springs had grown around the natural spring feeding the Cottonwood River, its single main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, projecting optimism and the harsh frontier rarely rewarded. The Whiskey Bend Saloon dominated one-end batwing doors, spilling yellow lamplight and raucous laughter. At the opposite end stood the modest schoolhouse where Nora worked. But Victor Dietrich's corrupting influence was visible everywhere. His armed men lounged outside the saloon with weapons displayed in casual intimidation. Company store prices were posted prominently: flour at 3 times normal rates, work boots costing a week's wages in worthless scrip. Even the church appeared subdued, its windows dark, despite evening service hour. "Where first?" Dr. Edwin asked quietly as they passed the sheriff's office. Through the dusty window, they could see Malcolm hunched over his desk, probably counting the latest fines and emergency taxes. "On the saloon," Matilda decided. "If Victor's holding court there, I want witnesses when I confront him about these fraudulent charges." They stopped behind the doctor's narrow office. Hayamovi tested his wound carefully, Ruth stitching pulled, but held firm, and the professional bandaging allowed greater movement. "Are you certain about this direct approach?" he asked, as they prepared to enter what could become a deadly trap. "Once we show ourselves publicly, there's no more hiding." "I've been hiding for 6 months," she replied, adjusting the nurse's cap to shadow her features. Keeping quiet, accepting Victor's lies, hoping someone else would solve this problem. Quiet got me nothing but deeper debt and bigger threats. Dr. Edwin led them through his office's back entrance and then out front to maintain their fiction. The saloon's bat-wing doors swung open as they approached, releasing clouds of tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey fumes. The Whiskey Ben's interior matched expectations: rough pine tables stained with spilled drinks, a makeshift bar from planks, and sawhorses' spittoons, showing more misses than hits, and clientele ranging from desperate to dangerous. But Victor Dietrich sat at the finest table like an emperor, his pale blue eyes and waxed mustache marking him as someone who'd never performed honest labor. Beside him sat Sheriff Malcolm Tinbadge, gleaming, and across from them lounged Greasy Pete, apparently reporting on the day's frustrated manhunt. Exhausted miners occupied nearby tables' faces, showing hollow exhaustion from being worked beyond endurance for worthless scrip. Matilda walked straight to Victor's table with chin-raised voice, carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "Victor Dietrich, I want to discuss the fraudulent charges you've illegally added to my family's account." The mine owner looked up with theatrical surprise, though calculating eyes revealed he'd expected this confrontation. "Mrs. Harper, how thoughtful of you to surrender voluntarily. Sheriff Malcolm has questions about your recent criminal activities. The only criminal here is you." Matilda replied with icy calm, pulling the water-damaged paper from her pocket. "These charges are dated after my husband's documented death for tools and services he never received. I have witnesses who can prove Jules was elsewhere on every single date." Victor examined the soggy document with exaggerated concern, while several miners exchanged meaningful glances. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, my dear woman. Our records are quite precise and legally binding. Jules borrowed extensively in his final weeks, probably hiding mounting debts from his devoted wife. Such financial irresponsibility often leads directly to tragic workplace accidents." The threat was crystal clear, but Matilda had expected no less. What surprised her was the visible reaction from miners. Several nodded grimly. An elderly Henrik muttered something unflattering in Norwegian. "Show her our official ledger," Malcolm suggested with satisfaction, producing a leather-bound book. Everything proper and legal filed with the territorial recorder. But Dr. Edwin stepped forward with professional authority. "Fascinating documentation. I treated several miners for injuries on these specific dates, including Henrik there, and I distinctly remember Jules helping him repair storm damage instead of borrowing mining tools." Henrik nodded vigorously with honest indignation. "Jules Harper, he was good man with generous heart. Helped me fix roof after terrible windstorm. Never borrow nothing from company store that day, I swear this on my dead father's grave." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign his plans were encountering resistance. The questionable testimony of foreign laborers against official territorial records. Any reasonable court knows which carries more legal weight. What about sworn testimony from the territorial medical examiner? Dr. Edwin pressed relentlessly. I personally signed Jules Harper's death certificate listing official time and date. Yet 3 of these charges are dated 2 full days after his documented burial, rather remarkable for a dead man to accumulate additional mining debts. A distinct murmur ran through the watching crowd. Even rough frontier justice recognized certain immutable facts. Death certificates carried official weight that even corrupt sheriffs found difficult to dismiss. Malcolm's hand drifted toward his holstered gun, but the gesture was interrupted by commotion, outside running feet and urgent voices suggesting new crisis. A young man burst through the doors, face flushed with panic. Sheriff Indians attacking the Morrison place burned the barn and scattered livestock. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient. But Malcolm seized the excuse to change subjects. You see clearly now, while honest citizens deal with real crimes, this woman wastes time with civil disputes. But Hayamovi had been listening carefully, and several details struck him as wrong. What specific tribe? He asked the messenger directly. Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Sioux? The young man looked confused by such questions. Just Indians, I reckon. With war paint and feathers and such? What color war paint exactly? What style of feathers? Different tribes use completely different markings for different purposes. Well, I think red and black paint mostly, and just regular feathers. Every actual Indian within 500 miles would have laughed at such vague description. War paint patterns carried specific spiritual and tribal significance. Feathers were earned through specific deeds and worn according to strict cultural protocols. The messenger's account sounded like someone describing a medicine show rather than witnessing a genuine raid. And the horse's hoofprints, shod or unshod, how many riders total? The increasingly flustered messenger was clearly out of his depth. When pressed for details, any genuine witness would remember clearly. Victor intervened smoothly, but his interruption only highlighted the suspicious timing. Enough pointless questions from known criminals, the mine owner declared with authority. Sheriff, arrest this woman immediately for fraud and conspiracy, and arrest this Indian for inciting violence. We'll sort out legal details later. Malcolm reached for his weapon with obvious relief, but before he could draw, a large rock crashed through the saloon's front window with tremendous force. Glass shards scattered while everyone dove for cover, creating perfect chaos. In the confusion, Matilda grabbed Dr. Edwin's arm as they ducked behind an overturned table. Hayamovi melted into shadows near the back door, like smoke dissolving in wind. "I'll go now," Hayamovi called over the shouting. Out the back way, they fought through the panicking crowd as more windows shattered. Outside, Baptiste and Laurent had created effective diversion by hurling stones from multiple directions, making it appear the building was surrounded. In the chaos, Malcolm couldn't determine which threats were real and which were misdirection. The 3 fugitives ran through darkness behind buildings, using knowledge of the town's layout to stay ahead of confused pursuit. Their destination was the schoolhouse, where Matilda hoped to find Nora safe and perhaps locate additional evidence. But as they approached the small wooden building serving Willow Springs' educational needs, they realized their enemies had anticipated this move. Warm lantern light flickered in windows, and distinct silhouettes of armed men were visible against internal illumination. Obviously, a trap. Hayamovi breathed. "They're using your sister as living bait." Through clear windows, they could observe Nora seated calmly at the teacher's desk, with hands folded peacefully in her lap. She appeared completely unharmed, but was clearly being held by dangerous captors. Snakebite Sue paced behind her chair like a caged predator, while 2 heavily armed gunmen flanked the primary entrances. "We need help," Dr. Edwin whispered urgently. "Baptiste and Laurent are still creating chaos at the saloon, but we can't take 4 armed killers alone." That's when a new voice spoke from concealing darkness behind them. "Maybe you don't have to try it alone. They spun to find Beatrice Morrison, the dedicated schoolteacher, emerging from behind cordwood with an old but well-maintained army rifle. Despite sharing a surname with Greasy Pete, she'd consistently proven herself a determined opponent of Victor's corruption. A no-blood relation to that snake Pete before anyone asks, she said with appropriate disgust. Morrison's common as dirt out here, and I'd rather be shot than claim family connection with Victor's pet killer. Now, if you want to rescue that girl alive, I know a secret way into the building they won't expect. Beatrice led them to a concealed storm cellar behind the schoolhouse. Its entrance artfully hidden by overgrown weeds and a strategically positioned broken wagon wheel. This connects directly to the school's root cellar through a tunnel system. The previous teacher excavated it to store supplies safely away from mice and dampness. As they prepared for dangerous underground infiltration, distant gunshots continued echoing from the main street, where Baptiste and Laurent kept Victor's men occupied. But time was running short. Eventually those distractions would fail, and the full weight of Victor's private army would descend like a crushing avalanche. Midpoint twist. The tunnel's musty darkness seemed endless as they crawled single file through the narrow passage knees, scraping against rough timber supports while breathing echoed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The root cellar beneath the schoolhouse carried familiar smells of stored apples and preserved vegetables, its earthen walls lined with neat shelves of mason jars and burlap sacks. A wooden ladder led upward to a trap door that would open directly behind the teacher's desk, where Nora was supposedly being held captive. Listen carefully first. Hayamovi warned in urgent whispers, pressing his ear to the floorboards above. Voices filtered down clearly through the wood snakebite Sue's harsh laughter, mixing with deeper male conversation that sounded strangely casual and relaxed, rather than tense hostage negotiations. Matilda climbed the rickety ladder with infinite care, testing each rung to avoid betraying creaks. At the top, she pressed her eye to a narrow crack in the trap door and peered into the schoolhouse's main room. What she observed made her blood freeze solid with shock and disbelief. Nora sat at the teacher's desk, exactly as they'd observed from outside. But her posture and demeanor weren't those of a frightened captive, desperately awaiting rescue. Instead, she was reading calmly from a sheet of paper, while Snakebite Sue listened with obvious approval. The two gunmen flanking the doors were completely relaxed, with weapons holstered, definitely not the alert stance of men expecting trouble or guarding a hostile prisoner. Mir should arrive within the hour, Nora was saying in a voice completely devoid of fear or distress. Matilda has always been overly protective of family members. She'll walk straight into whatever trap you've prepared without thinking through consequences properly. Sue's delighted cackle sent ice water through Matilda's heart and veins. Smart girl, exactly like Victor promised when he recruited you months ago. Playing the innocent school teacher's assistant while systematically feeding us detailed information about your sister's plans and movements, absolutely brilliant work that deserves generous compensation. The money certainly helps my situation considerably. Nora replied with matter-of-fact casualness, her tone as conversational as discussing weather. Teaching assistant wages barely cover food and rent, and Matilda's foolish crusade against Victor was going to get us both killed anyway. Much wiser to pick the winning side early and profit from superior intelligence. Matilda sagged against the ladder, the comprehensive betrayal hitting her like a devastating physical blow that drove all breath from her lungs. Her own sister, the person she'd risked everything to protect, had been secretly working for Victor all along. Every plan they'd made, every safe house they'd used, every ally they'd trusted, had been systematically reported back to their mortal enemies within hours. Below her, Hayamovi sensed something catastrophically wrong and climbed carefully up to investigate. When she silently pointed toward the crack with trembling fingers, he looked for himself and immediately understood why her face had gone deathly white. His own expression hardened like granite as he absorbed the full scope of elaborate deception. But the devastating revelations weren't finished. What about the Indian? one of the gunmen asked with professional interest. Victor specifically wants him alive, if possible, for some kind of public demonstration. Nora consulted her paper with mechanical efficiency. Hayamovi, of the northern Cheyenne, son of Chief Mapi. Victor believes he can use him as leverage to force treaty revision opening Thunder Valley to unrestricted mining operations. The credible threat of a chief's son being publicly hanged for murder should make the tribal council significantly more cooperative in future negotiations. And if they refuse Victor's generous terms, Sue inquired with obvious predatory interest, then Hayamovi dies very publicly and dramatically, and Victor blames the execution on army justice responding to savage Indian raids. Either way, the Cheyenne lose their most effective advocate for maintaining existing water rights. The pieces of Victor's comprehensive regional strategy fell into place with devastating clarity. This had never been simply about debt collection or land acquisition. Victor was methodically orchestrating complete territorial takeover, using Matilda's manufactured debts and Hayamovi's fabricated crimes as legal pretexts to eliminate the two most dangerous threats to his expansion plans. The clerk Lucian has unfortunately become a serious problem. Nora continued with businesslike efficiency. He's been asking too many pointed questions about payment records and obvious discrepancies in official books. Dr. Edwin is also growing suspicious about the convenient pattern of mining accidents. Victor wants both permanently silenced before they cause genuine trouble. Consider it done. Sue replied as casually as discussing dinner preparations. Accidents happen constantly on the frontier. Lucian could easily fall into a mine shaft during routine inspection, and doctors sometimes get caught in crossfire during Indian raids that turn violent. Through the narrow crack, Matilda watched her own sister nod approvingly at planned murders of two completely innocent men, whose only crimes were possessing conscience and courage. This wasn't simply betrayal for monetary gain, it was active, calculated participation in Victor's campaign of systematic terror and murder. What about the evidence Jules supposedly hid before his convenient death? One gunman asked. Victor remains worried about those missing survey documents and witness statements that could trigger federal investigation. Nora's smile was clearly visible, even from below, and it was the coldest, most calculating expression Matilda had ever seen on any human face. There is no hidden evidence anywhere. I invented that entire story to keep Matilda focused on seeking revenge instead of simply fleeing the territory where she might cause trouble later from a safe distance. Jules never suspected the raids were fake. He was only investigating routine safety violations and wage theft, nothing more comprehensive or dangerous than that. The final devastating piece clicked into place. Jules had died not because he'd uncovered Victor's grand conspiracy, but because he'd discovered relatively mundane corruption that could still have brought unwanted federal attention. Nora had deliberately created the entire narrative about hidden evidence and framed raids to manipulate her sister's grief into predictable patterns that Victor could exploit with mathematical precision. Matilda had been playing a completely rigged game from the start, guided by false information provided by her own sister working directly for the enemy. Every choice she'd made, every risk she'd taken, every moment of hope or despair had been anticipated and countered because Nora was systematically reporting their plans to Victor's organization. Below in the cramped tunnel, Dr. Edwin and Beatrice waited tensely for intelligence about what lay ahead. Hayamovi descended carefully and drew them into urgent, whispered conference that would shatter every assumption they'd made about allies and enemies. Complete trap, he explained in barely audible whispers. Nora Harper has been working for Victor from the beginning. Everything we planned, everywhere we went, everyone we trusted, she's been systematically reporting it all. Beatrice's face went pale in dim light. That means they know about Baptiste and Laurent's diversions. They know we're here right now, Dr. Edwin cursed softly under his breath. And they know about Lucian helping us access mine records. The poor boy is probably already dead, but Matilda had heard enough devastating revelation for one lifetime. The shock and betrayal were crystallizing into something infinitely harder and more dangerous: cold fury, tempered by absolute clarity, that comes when every comfortable illusion has been stripped away by brutal truth. She'd spent months trying to save a sister who had sold her out for Victor's gold and promised security. "No more hiding," she whispered as she rejoined them in the tunnel's cramped darkness. "No more playing defense or hoping for rescue. If Nora wants to work for Victor Dietrich, she can face the consequences alongside him when this is finished." Above them, Sue's voice drifted down through the wood. "They should arrive any moment now. Make sure you look properly frightened and helpless when your dear sister comes to rescue you, sweetie. Really sell the performance for maximum effect." But the performance was about to change in ways none of Victor's people had anticipated or prepared for. The quiet widow, who'd spent months accepting abuse and running from confrontation, had just learned that her own family had betrayed her from the very beginning of this nightmare. What would emerge from that tunnel would be something far more dangerous than anything Victor Dietrich had ever faced in his career of territorial conquest and systematic intimidation. Second obstacle. They retreated through the tunnel in absolute silence, each person processing the magnitude of Nora's betrayal. When they emerged into the storm cellar, Beatrice took immediate charge with decisive authority. "The mine office," she said with quiet determination. "If we can obtain the real ledgers showing payments to fake raiders, we still have evidence that even territorial authorities can't ignore. But we must move extremely fast. Victor will have the place heavily guarded by now." Dr. Edwin shook his head with obvious skepticism. "Pure suicide, after what we discovered. They know we're coming, probably have 20 guns waiting in ambush." "Maybe so." Matilda agreed, surprising everyone with her unnaturally calm tone. "But they're expecting the same frightened widow who's been running and hiding for months. They're not expecting someone who finally understands the game is rigged and doesn't care about playing by their rules anymore." Hayamovi studied her face in dim starlight, noting the fundamental change that had come over her during those terrible moments in the tunnel. The betrayal had burned away something soft and trusting, leaving behind steel tempered in emotional fire. They made their way through Willow Springs' back alleys, avoiding the main street where Victor's men continued their search. The mine office sat on the town's eastern edge, a squat wooden building surrounded by stacks of ore cars and mining equipment, casting strange shadows in moonlight. "Lucian's still alive." Dr. Edwin breathed as they crept closer. Through a window, they could see the young clerk working frantically at a desk covered with ledger books and scattered papers, his face showing unmistakable fear. But as they watched from concealment, the office's front door burst open with violent force. 3 armed men entered with obvious hostile intent. Lucian looked up with terror-widened eyes as Coyote Kid leveled a pistol directly at his chest. "Victor wants to know exactly what you told that doctor," Kid said without preamble. "Start talking truthful or start dying slow and painful like." Inside the lamplit office, Lucian's voice shook like autumn leaves. I just said someone should check on the injured railroad worker. That's absolutely all. I never mentioned anything about the books or payment records or..." His desperate words were cut off by a vicious backhand that sent him sprawling across the desk. Papers scattered as blood began flowing from his split lip. "Wrong answer, clerk." Kid snarled with obvious enjoyment. "Try again with more honesty this time around." Outside, Matilda made a decision that would have been impossible for the woman she'd been that morning before learning the truth about family loyalty. "I'm going in there," she announced with quiet finality. "That's exactly what they want." Hayamovi protested urgently. "You walk through that door and you're dead before you can draw breath." "Maybe. But Lucian dies for certain if we do nothing, and he's the only witness who can testify about the payment records." Besides, they want me alive. Nora made that crystal clear during her performance. I'm more valuable as bait than as a corpse. Before anyone could physically stop her, she walked boldly to the office's front door and knocked politely. The sound echoed through the night like gunshots, freezing everyone inside into shocked tableau. "Good evening, gentlemen." She called through the door in a conversational tone that suggested a social visit. "I'm here to discuss my account with Victor Dietrich. I believe there's been some serious misunderstanding about charges and payments that needs immediate clarification." The door swung open to reveal Coyote Kid's astounded face, his expression showing he'd clearly expected many things, but definitely not a polite widow making business calls during a manhunt. "Well, don't just stand there gaping like a landed fish." Matilda continued briskly pushing past him into the office with supreme confidence. "I haven't got all night to waste on this nonsense. Where exactly are the real ledgers that show Victor's payments to men who stage Indian raids for his benefit?" Her completely unexpected behavior threw off the gunman's timing entirely. They'd prepared for desperate fugitives or terrified captives, but definitely not someone treating the situation like a routine business appointment conducted during normal hours. "The real ledgers," she repeated with growing impatience, looking around the cluttered office with professional interest. "The ones documenting payments to men who stage raids and blame innocent tribes for crimes they never committed. Lucian, I assume you've been keeping accurate records of these fraudulent transactions." The young clerk, blood still dripping from his injuries, caught on quickly to her dangerous game. "Yes, ma'am. Right here in the strongbox. Payment vouchers, dates, amounts, and detailed recipient descriptions for every illegal transaction." Coyote Kid finally found his voice and some semblance of authority. "You're under arrest for armed robbery and— for what exactly?" Matilda interrupted with sharp challenge. "Asking to examine business records, questioning fraudulent charges on my account. Last I heard, those weren't federal crimes in civilized territories." While she kept the gunmen off balance with aggressive confidence and legal questions they couldn't answer properly, Hayamovi and the others moved into position outside the windows. The office's thin walls wouldn't stop bullets, but they offered concealment for the desperate plan taking shape. Besides, Matilda continued warming to her theme and clearly enjoying their confusion. "I think you'll find I have more legal standing here than any of you do. These men you work for, Pete, sue yourself. None of you are legitimately deputized peace officers with real authority. You're just hired killers working for a man who's been systematically defrauding miners and settlers for personal profit. Sheriff Malcolm deputized us special for this emergency." One gunman protested weakly. With what authority? Malcolm's jurisdiction covers only municipal matters within town limits. This mine office sits on territorial land, which means federal law applies exclusively. And federal law takes an extremely dim view of armed robbery, systematic extortion, and conspiracy to incite warfare between settlers and Indian tribes. Her legal knowledge was admittedly sketchy, but it sounded impressive enough to make them hesitate uncertainly. That moment of hesitation proved absolutely fatal to their cause. Hayamovi's shot through the window extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the office into complete darkness. Dr. Edwin and Beatrice followed immediately with covering fire as Matilda grabbed Lucian and pulled him toward the strongbox, where incriminating evidence waited. "The combination," she shouted over gunfire that was already drawing attention from across town. 18 right, 7 left, 24 right. Lucian replied, his fingers working frantically at the dial, despite bullets whistling overhead like deadly insects. The lock clicked open just as Coyote Kid recovered his composure, enough to send a shot that splintered the wall mere inches from Matilda's head. She ducked low and began stuffing papers into her dress pockets with desperate efficiency: payment, vouchers, correspondence. Anything that might serve as evidence in federal court. But reinforcements were arriving outside, drawn by the sound of battle, and the office's few exits were being systematically blocked by men with superior numbers and firepower. Surrounded. Dr. Edwin called from his position near the back door, his voice tight with strain. At least 12 men out there, maybe more, and they're setting up proper positions for a siege. Outside, Victor's voice cut through the night air with cold authority. Burn them out completely. Fire arrows and coal oil reduce this place to ashes and everyone in it. The acrid smell of smoke began filtering through the walls as flames took hold of the dry timber construction. They had minutes before the building became their funeral pyre. The mine shaft. Lucienne gasped through gritted teeth, hit in the shoulder by a ricochet and bleeding steadily. Ventilation tunnel behind the assay equipment. Drops 20 feet connects to main workings. Dangerous flooded sections, bad air cave-ins. Where exactly? Matilda demanded, still grabbing documents while flames spread. Behind the scales and ore samples. But it's extremely dangerous. Underground you could drown, or suffocate, or get trapped by rock slides. The shaft behind the equipment offered their only escape, despite all the underground dangers Lucian had warned about. Death by drowning or cave-in seemed preferable to death by fire or bullets. As they prepared for their descent into the Earth's dark belly, none realized the worst dangers still waited below, where Victor's most elaborate trap was ready to spring with devastating finality. Climax. The first fire arrow punched through the office wall like a flaming spear, followed immediately by the acrid stench of burning pine and the ominous crackle of flames finding purchase in bone-dry timber. Matilda frantically stuffed the last incriminating documents inside her dress as thick smoke began choking the air with deadly efficiency. The shaft. Lucian pointed with his uninjured arm toward a narrow opening partially concealed behind mining scales and ore samples. Hurry, before this whole place becomes a furnace. Hayamavi kicked aside the heavy equipment blocking their desperate escape route, revealing a circular opening barely wide enough for one person. The ventilation shaft plunged into absolute darkness, its depths invisible in the flickering light of spreading flames. Without hesitation, he swung himself over the edge and began descending the crude wooden ladder, bolted to the shaft's slick walls. Matilda next, Dr. Edwin commanded, helping her toward the opening as burning debris began raining from the ceiling like hellish snow. I'll manage, Lucian. She dropped into the shaft with her heart hammering violently, the precious documents crinkled against her chest while gunfire echoed from above, as Victor's men realized their quarry was escaping underground. The ladder rungs were treacherously slippery with condensation and algae deadly in darkness that swallowed everything below the burning office. 20 feet felt like 200 as she descended rung by careful rung, knowing one misstep meant certain death on the rocks below. Hayamovi caught her at the bottom, steadying her in ankle-deep water that covered the tunnel floor with ice-cold runoff. The air was suffocatingly thick and humid, heavy with mineral deposits, and the smell of wet earth that made every breath a conscious struggle. Behind them, Dr. Edwin's voice echoed down the shaft as he helped wounded Lucian make the dangerous one-handed descent. They began moving through the tunnel as quickly as treacherous footing allowed, supporting Lucian between them, while Dr. Edwin brought up the rear. Above shouting and gunfire continued as Victor's men fought the flames they'd started or searched for other entries into the mine system. The tunnel curved and branched repeatedly, a maze following ore deposits with no regard for navigation. Some passages were wide enough for equipment. Others narrowed to shoulder-wide gaps requiring sideways movement. All were partially flooded with water levels rising and falling unpredictably. Stop! Hayamovi's whisper froze them. Ahead, lamplight flickered on wet walls, accompanied by splashing boots and harsh voices. They pressed against rough stone as voices grew closer. Pete's distinctive drawl was unmistakable. Check every passage. They're down here with those papers, and Victor wants them badly enough to pay serious bonuses for results. What about the sister? Another voice asked casually. What about her? Pete replied with chilling indifference. She served her purpose well enough. Victor's got what he needed from that family. Might be simpler all around if they all had convenient mining accidents tonight and disappeared permanently. The casual discussion of murdering even their own collaborator galvanized Matilda with fresh rage that burned hotter than the flames above. Nora's betrayal had been calculated and mercenary, but at least her sister still breathed. If caught now, even Nora wouldn't survive long enough to enjoy her blood money. The search party moved past their hiding place, but more were coming. Additional boots and voices suggested Victor had committed serious manpower to the underground hunt. "Can't keep running blind through this maze," Dr. Edwin whispered with obvious strain. "Need an exit they haven't anticipated, or we'll be trapped down here until we starve or they find us." "Main shaft," Lucian suggested weakly, his shoulder leaving bloody drops in muddy water. "Service ladder goes straight to surface, but it emerges right in Victor's compound." "How many guards normally?" Hayamovi asked, already knowing they had no real choice. "Depends on how many he sent down here after us. Night shift is usually 3 or 4 men total if we're lucky." They began working toward the main shaft, following Lucian's whispered directions while avoiding patrols and flooded sections where splashing would echo through the entire system. The main shaft opened like a cathedral of stone and timber walls rising into darkness beyond any light's reach. Massive wooden framework supported pulleys and cables for ore cars, while a narrow service ladder zigzagged up one wall toward distant surface. Far above stars marked the opening, impossibly remote, but their only hope. But they weren't alone in the cathedral-like space. "Well, well, well," came a familiar voice from shadows near the ladder's base. "Look what finally crawled up from the deep like rats leaving a sinking ship." Snakebite Sue stepped into view with her knife-drawn blade gleaming with deadly promise. Behind her, 2 gunmen kept weapons trained on the exhausted fugitives who'd finally run out of places to hide. Victor's getting mighty impatient with this whole situation. Sue continued conversationally, as if discussing weather. "Wants his papers back and wants you people dead. Nothing personal, you understand, just good business practices that keep operations running smooth. Those papers prove Victor's been staging Indian raids and murdering innocent settlers." Matilda said clearly, her voice carrying in the shaft's natural acoustic chamber. "Anyone who helps cover this up becomes accessory to mass murder and federal crimes." Sue's harsh laughter echoed off stone walls like breaking glass. "You think I give a tinker's damn about dead farmers and their precious treaties with savages Victor pays in real gold that spends the same, regardless of where it comes from or who dies for it." The gunmen spread out to prevent escape, while Sue advanced with her knife, clearly intending personal, painful death. But she'd made a critical error about the changes betrayal and desperation had wrought. When Sue lunged with practiced skill, Matilda didn't retreat or cower as expected. Instead, she stepped inside the attack, with movements honed by months of desperate survival, grabbing a heavy mining pick from a nearby tool rack and swinging it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The impact sent Sue's knife spinning away into darkness, while the woman screamed in pain and fury, clutching her shattered wrist. The brief distraction gave Hayamovi exactly the opening he needed. His rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, and 2 gunmen dropped before they could adjust their aim or fire effective shots. But many more were coming. The sound of running feet echoed through multiple tunnels as Victor's search parties converged on the main shaft like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "Up the ladder," Dr. Edwin shouted, pushing wounded Lucian toward the wooden framework. "Move fast before they surround us completely." They began climbing as quickly as Lucian's condition would allow, the service ladders swaying dangerously under their combined weight, while Sue screamed orders to arriving reinforcements far below. The ascent felt endless, 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, while bullets began flying upward from multiple positions around the shaft's base. Halfway to salvation, disaster struck with devastating force. A rope somewhere in the ancient pulley system gave way with a sharp crack like breaking bones, sending an empty ore car plummeting past them toward the shaft's bottom. The massive impact when it hit shook the entire wooden framework violently, and several ladder rungs snapped under the sudden stress like twigs in a storm. Lucian lost his precarious grip and would have fallen to certain death if Hayamovi hadn't caught his good arm at the last possible second. The wounded clerk hung suspended over empty space, while Dr. Edwin and Matilda climbed desperately toward the surface, knowing every second of delay brought more guns to bear on their exposed position. "Can't hold on much longer." Lucian gasped, his injured shoulder unable to support his full weight indefinitely. Below them, muzzle flashes lit the shaft like deadly lightning as Victor's men opened fire with everything they had. Bullets spanged off wooden framework and shattered against stone walls, filling the air with lethal splinters and ricochets. The sound was absolutely deafening in the confined space, a thunderous cacophony that made communication nearly impossible and threatened to burst their eardrums. Matilda reached the surface first, hauling herself over the rim into cool night air, with lungs burning from exertion and fear. The mining compound was smaller than expected buildings clustered around the main shaft, with equipment yards spread across cleared ground. But it definitely wasn't deserted or unguarded. "There!" shouted Sheriff Malcolm from across the compound, standing with armed men near torches and lanterns. "The fugitives are coming up the main shaft like moles." More gunfire erupted as Malcolm's men opened up from long range, their bullets kicking up dirt and sparks around the shaft opening. Matilda threw herself flat behind mining equipment and began returning fire with a pistol taken from one of Hayamovi's victims, though accuracy at this distance was questionable. Dr. Edwin emerged, dragging Lucian the clerk barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Hayamovi appeared last, his rifle adding its voice as he covered their retreat toward the nearest substantial cover, a wooden building housing equipment. But Victor had prepared for this exact contingency with his usual thoroughness. As they ran across open ground under heavy fire, new riders appeared on the compound's perimeter like cavalry arriving at the last moment. But these weren't more hired guns, they wore federal marshal uniforms with Lieutenant Morrison commanding professional soldiers, federal officers. The lieutenant shouted over chaos and gunfire. "Cease firing immediately and surrender." The appearance of legitimate federal authority changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Malcolm's men hesitated, uncertain whether to obey orders or continue shooting, while Victor's gunmen looked desperately to their employer for guidance that wasn't forthcoming. In that crucial moment of confusion and indecision, Matilda made the most important gamble of her life. She stood up in full view of everyone present and held the stolen documents high above her head like a battle flag snapping in the wind. "These papers prove Victor Dietrich has been staging Indian raids and murdering innocent settlers," she shouted at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying clearly across the compound. "He's been framing peaceful tribes to steal their treaty lands for mining operations." She's lying through her teeth. Victor's voice cut across the compound as he emerged from behind the burning office building, his usual composure finally cracking under pressure. "Those documents are obvious forgeries created by criminals trying to escape justice for their crimes." But Lieutenant Morrison rode closer with the professional skepticism of a man who'd investigated too many frontier emergencies that conveniently benefited local business interests. His hand rested casually on his saber hilt as he studied the scene with calculating eyes. "Wardiyam, what kind of document specifically, ma'am?" he asked with formal courtesy that carried unmistakable authority. "Payment vouchers to men who staged fake Indian attacks," Matilda replied with crystal clarity. "Correspondence between Victor Dietrich and corrupt officials. Testimony from witnesses who saw raids being planned and executed by white men wearing war paint as disguises. All lies and fabrications." Malcolm interjected desperately, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "This woman owes substantial legitimate debts to established businesses and has been using her Indian accomplice to intimidate honest citizens throughout the territory." The lieutenant's expression suggested he'd heard remarkably similar stories before and had learned to be deeply suspicious of situations where local law enforcement and business interests aligned too conveniently for mere coincidence. Icar, I'll need to examine those documents personally. He announced with authority that brooked no argument whatsoever. And I'll want to hear sworn testimony from all parties involved before making any arrests or final decisions. Victor's face went absolutely white with barely controlled fury and desperation. His entire criminal empire depended completely on controlling information flow and preventing outside scrutiny. The arrival of federal authorities meant questions he couldn't answer and investigations he couldn't stop or control through bribery and intimidation. "Kill them all," he screamed at his remaining men with the hysteria of a cornered animal facing inevitable doom. "Kill them right now, before they can spread more lies and destroy everything we've built." The careful facade of legitimacy finally crumbled completely as Victor's desperation overrode his caution and political instincts. His gunmen opened fire on everyone present, fugitives and federal officers alike, in a final desperate attempt to eliminate all witnesses to their extensive crimes. But Lieutenant Morrison and his federal marshals weren't frontier deputies who could be bought, intimidated, or outgunned by superior numbers. They were professional soldiers with proper training and military discipline, and they responded to the unprovoked attack with devastating efficiency that ended the firefight within minutes. In the sudden silence that followed, punctuated only by the crackling of flames and the groans of wounded men scattered across the compound like broken dolls, Matilda found herself face to face with the man who'd systematically destroyed her life and threatened everything she held dear. Victor Dietrich stood alone in his burning empire of corruption, his kingdom of lies collapsing around him like a house of cards in a prairie windstorm. The quiet widow he'd tried to break had emerged from fire and betrayal as something infinitely more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. Resolution. 3 weeks after Victor Dietrich's arrest and the complete collapse of his criminal empire, autumn had settled over the Nebraska territory, with the promise of harsh winter ahead. The federal investigation had proven even more extensive than initially suspected. Victor's network of corruption had reached into multiple territories and involved dozens of officials now facing comprehensive criminal charges in federal courts. Matilda stood outside the newly reopened mine office, watching as honest workers lined up to receive their first wages in actual currency rather than worthless company scrip. The federal receivers had immediately abolished the exploitative store system and established fair pricing throughout the region. Men who'd labored in virtual slavery finally had real money to send families and genuine hope for prosperity through honest work. Dr. Edwin had been appointed territorial medical examiner, allowing him to investigate suspicious deaths and ensure workplace safety violations received proper attention. His first official act had been ordering comprehensive safety improvements in all mining operations paid directly from Victor's seized assets. The Cheyenne delegation had departed after signing formal agreements recognizing their water rights and establishing shared grazing areas with local ranchers. The staged raids had ended completely with Victor's arrest, and relations between settlers and tribal members were slowly improving as truth about his systematic deception spread throughout the territory. Matilda found Hyamovi near the Cottonwood River, where they'd first encountered each other during that desperate night that had changed both their lives forever. He sat quietly on the grass-covered bank, while thunder grazed peacefully nearby the autumn air, carrying scents of turning leaves and winter's approaching promise. "Your wound has healed remarkably well," she observed, settling beside him with easy familiarity earned through shared trials that had tested them both beyond normal human endurance. "Thanks to extremely skilled nursing," he replied warmly. "Though I suspect the seamstress who stitched it possesses many talents beyond needlework and medical assistance." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past on its eternal journey toward distant seas. The water ran clear and strong, now no longer diverted by Victor's illegal channels, and fish were already returning to sections artificially dried for months. "Lieutenant Morrison has requested my testimony at Victor's federal trial," Matilda said eventually. It means traveling to the territorial capital, probably staying several weeks, while prosecutors present their comprehensive case against him and his accomplices. Hayamovi nodded understanding. Crucial work that could prevent similar corruption elsewhere. Federal prosecutors need credible witnesses who can explain clearly how the conspiracy operated and who was involved at every level. They've asked you to testify as well about the staged raids and systematic threats against your people's treaty rights. The tribal council has agreed someone should speak for us in the white man's court system. Though many elders would prefer traditional justice methods, Victor would find considerably less comfortable. Before he could elaborate on traditional Cheyenne justice, approaching hoofbeats interrupted their private conversation. Henry Boyle rode up with characteristic deliberate pace, his weathered face showing unusual excitement that was quite rare for the normally pragmatic farmer. "Thought you folks should know immediately," he called as he dismounted with obvious urgency. Federal Marshal just rode through town with important news from the territorial capital. They opened Victor's private safe in his office there, and you absolutely won't believe what they discovered inside. He handed them an official document bearing territorial seals and federal stamps, validating its complete authenticity. Matilda read it twice before the full implications became clear and settled into her understanding. Jules's water rights deed. She breathed with amazement that bordered on disbelief. The original document that disappeared after his death. Victor had stolen and hidden it all this time to prevent legal challenges to his operations. The deed was dated 6 months before Jules's murder and established clear legal ownership of water rights, encompassing not only their original homestead, but significant portions of the entire Cottonwood River system. Victor had stolen it specifically to prevent legal challenges to his diversion schemes, but its existence proved Jules had been much closer to exposing the full conspiracy than anyone had realized. There's even more. Henry continued with obvious satisfaction and growing excitement. The deed establishes joint ownership between your family and the Cheyenne tribe, based on an earlier treaty that Victor thought he'd completely destroyed. Your husband was apparently working on a comprehensive legal framework for shared water management when he was murdered to silence him permanently. Hayamovi studied the document with growing amazement and hope for the future. This changes absolutely everything for both our peoples. With legal water rights firmly established and properly documented, no mining company or railroad corporation can divert the river system without explicit permission from both parties working together. Exactly right. Henry agreed enthusiastically. And the federal government is establishing a joint commission to manage water allocation for the entire region going forward. They're actively seeking people with knowledge of local conditions and demonstrated experience in dealing with competing interests fairly and successfully. The opportunity was remarkable, a genuine chance to build something positive and lasting from the wreckage of Victor's criminal empire, while ensuring future development served everyone's interests rather than enriching a few powerful individuals at everyone else's expense. As the sun set over Thunder Valley, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson that promised fair weather ahead, Matilda and Hayamovi rode side by side toward the Cheyenne encampment, where his aunt Wachiwi waited to hear about the day's developments and their decisions about the future they would build together. Their wedding ceremony 3 days later skillfully blended Cheyenne customs with territorial legal requirements, creating something entirely new that honored both traditions while recognizing practical realities of their shared responsibilities. Wachiwi had finally agreed that a quiet, submissive wife might not be practical for a man whose duties extended far beyond his own lodge to encompass entire communities' welfare and survival. As winter settled over Thunder Valley with snow that promised good moisture for spring crops, the newlyweds established their home in a cabin deliberately straddling the boundary between settler and tribal lands, a practical symbol of their commitment to bridging differences and building something better from the ashes of corruption and violence that had nearly destroyed both their peoples. The quiet life Wachiwi had once envisioned for her nephew was still possible, but it would be built on foundations of shared purpose and mutual respect that proved stronger than either tradition or convenience alone. The wild woman who'd ridden desperately through that long-ago storm had found not merely survival, but a genuine chance to create the kind of future that honored both the past's wisdom and the promise of what was yet to come. The frontier had demanded everything they could give, but it had also rewarded their courage with something precious beyond gold. A partnership that could weather any storm and build lasting peace from the raw materials of hope, determination, and love. Born in the crucible of shared adversity and mutual trust that would endure for generations to come.